Mimi, thank you very much for making time to share your insights into the future of leadership. But before we go into the future, can you tell us a little bit about your own background? Where did you grow up?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. My background has been very eclectic. I was born in the DRC in Kinshasa. My mom is from Rwanda, my dad from the DRC. My father was a diplomat, and so we spent a lot of time traveling across the world when I was very young. We lived in Brussels, eventually lived in Lisbon for a long time, which allowed me to pick up different languages and really get accustomed to different cultures around the world. We eventually settled in South Africa in 1991 or so, and it was an interesting time to grow up in South Africa as a Pan-African and international citizen. Really exciting birth of a democracy happening here. And so I really enjoyed being in South Africa at that time. And then eventually in my teens and early adulthood, I lived in London for a number of years, and I went to school in New York. So my background, like I said before, is very eclectic, very varied, and to me, exciting because I picked up so much along the way.
So is it fair to say today you are a global citizen?
Absolutely. I think that, given how small the world is now, I think everybody's a global citizen. You only have to, you live in Berlin and I'm having a conversation with you from Johannesburg. And who knows, the people who are listening to our conversation, probably come from all corners of the world. So we're all global citizens in some way. But yes, I feel very fortunate that I was exposed to so much of the world at such a young age.
And tell us, Mimi, what was your dream career when you grew up?
So I always knew that I wanted to be in the media space. I just didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And as many young people do who choose a career path, I kind of fumbled my way in the media industry in all sorts of capacities. But it was always my intention to do something that had to do with storytelling. I loved storytelling. I knew that, growing up, that stories had such a powerful impact on people. And because they had such an important impact on my life, as a young African living in Europe, I saw the impact of how stories were told in Europe in that Western context about where I came from. And it was very interesting because I think I came from, a somewhat privileged household, given the circumstances at that time. And so the image that people had in Europe at that time of Africa were so contradictory to my own life and what I had lived growing up. And I knew that that was because of the power of the stories that they had been told, or the stories that they had been exposed to. The same thing when we moved to South Africa in the early 90s. Growing up, I spoke many languages, but I certainly didn't speak English, at least until I was 14 or 15 years old. And the way that I learned to speak English was through stories. I watched a lot of soap operas. I learned to read books in English. I was exposed to stories all over my life, in all aspects of my existence. And they had such a powerful impact on my life, and I saw on the environment around me as well. So I always knew that I wanted to be a storyteller in some capacity. I knew that media was a way for me to get there. I just didn't know what the path looked like. But, nobody knows exactly what their path looks like.
Absolutely. And I see, obviously, especially on LinkedIn, you are a master at telling African stories. So can you tell us a little bit about what is it that makes African stories so unique and so powerful?
Well, I think that, probably because, there is one African story, but at the same time, there isn't one African story. We have such a complex and beautiful and very, diverse continent in all spheres, politically, socioeconomically, culturally, our traditions, our languages, and I think that is something that makes Africa very unique. There's just an endless well of knowledge, and like I said before, stories to tell. It's almost infinite. And then there's also our similarities. I think that more than ever, especially nowadays, we're all facing in the same direction. We're all looking to accomplish the same things: economic growth, political emancipation, cultural coherence. And all of these things are the things that we have in common. And I think that telling African stories or bringing them to the forefront helps to give us a platform to have those discussions, to say, well, how do we actually get there as a collective, but also taking into considerations of very strong differences that make us unique. So I think that for me is why I love African stories, without stating the obvious, that I'm obviously African and I have, very African roots, and also from different parts of the continent. East Africa, my Rwandan roots; Central Africa, my DRC roots; and then South Africa, where I grew up. So I'm fascinated by this continent because I'm African, but also because I think we are at a pivotal time in our story, in our history, where we need to take into consideration the things that make us unique and different, but also the things that bring us together.
And Mimi, you are a Tutu Fellow. You sit on the board of Brand Africa. Can you tell us, what is your vision for Africa?
I think that my vision is very much aligned with the visions that we have for ourselves and that have been expressed through numerous agendas, that have been brought to the front by, numerous organizations. So the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the African Union's Agenda 2063, those are all aspirations of Africans from all walks of life from across the continent. And I'm very much aligned with those aspirations in their totality. If I had to pick a few that I am championing in my own space, but I'm also very passionate about, I think there would be three. The first one is the possibility of Africa's narrative being told by Africans themselves. And that, is something that, like we say, you don't really know, you can't grasp the possibilities of a brighter future without really understanding your past. And so, Africans being in a position where they can tell their own stories is something that's important to me. The second one is women and women. I don't like the term empowerment, to be completely honest. If you follow my journey, you'll understand why. But gender equality, gender parity, gender equity is something that is vital to our growth as a continent, given the demographics of women, and also the entrepreneurial spirit and just the mere persistence and resilience and stamina that women have shown on this continent. And then lastly, I think issues that have to do with the youth. I think that the youth of Africa, given their number and also given their ability to innovate for Africa's problems and challenges, and to really come up with solutions that are uniquely based and adequate for the environment in which we live. That youth can either be a complete liability for the continent and for the rest of the world, or they could be an asset. And so I'm really passionate about making sure that they are the latter, that they are an asset to the continent's growth, and doing everything in my power and supporting organizations that are working towards making that happen.
And tell us, Mimi, looking back at your early days, who inspired you?
I found inspiration everywhere. First, my grandmother, who was a formidable woman, coming from Rwanda and having lived through the country's change over numerous decades, from genocides in 1950s to seeing the genocide in 1994 to seeing Rwanda rise to where she is now as a country. It is, it was an amazing thing to watch her be so resilient through those times, to bring up 7 children on her own, and to make sure that she placed her stone of contribution in the continent's story. So my grandmother was a huge, and is still a very big inspiration for me. And then, I look at the everyday African women. I just look at women entrepreneurs who are, my friends and part of my network, and, and even those that I don't know. And I see how much we're pushing in every single aspect of our lives to really, make sure that we are heard, make sure that we are contributing positively to the economies of our countries, while we're building families at the same time. And I'm hugely inspired by that. So I think that, those are the two places where I find inspiration, one in my own family, but also more generally looking at African women from all spheres of life and geographies, and drawing inspirations from their strength and their triumphs.
And Mimi, tell us, you're having a very illustrious career. You started off as a presenter at Channel O and MTV. You were an account director at Weber Shandrick, Africa lead at Fleischmann Hillard. Today you are running your own media group. Looking back over your career, would you say there was a major turning point? Or maybe a number of turning points?
Absolutely. I mean, there were definitely a number of turning points. Looking back at Channel O, it's very interesting that you bring that up, because I sometimes forget that I was a presenter on Channel O. It was so long ago. But that was a major turning point because it was my entry into the world of storytelling, into the world of media. I was very young at the time. I saw what was at the time the equivalent of MTV in Africa. And, we'd grown up watching MTV and just being absolutely fascinated by the concept of having a 24-hour music television channel. And then we had our own. And I remember calling Channel O and speaking to a lady called Zandile Nzalo, who was running the channel at that time. And I said, this is fantastic. What a great idea. But I have one little request. If you're going to speak to the rest of the continent, Channel O was based in South Africa at the time. You need to have diversity in terms of your presenters. You need to have presenters from all over the continent, not just one or two places. And they also need to be able to speak all languages, English, French, Portuguese, etc. And I said, I can do that. Please give me a chance. And she did. And that was the beginning of a very interesting and exciting journey. And so that was a huge turning point for me. The second turning point was going to MTV. In Europe, I was the first African woman to present a show on MTV Europe. And so just being lifted out of my continent, being placed in a global arena. But the feed that I presented on MTV also streamed into Africa. And so that was such an inspirational journey because I received mail almost on a daily basis from young people across the continent saying, oh my goodness, if you made it on MTV, I mean, we can too. This is such a big deal. And so being able to give them that, that inspiration and something to aspire to was hugely gratifying for me and a major turning point for me. And then, over the years, I found my way into public relations by working with, global PR firms and really understanding that communications and media could be used in a really strategic way to start shifting people's perceptions about brands, about countries, about continents, about people, to shift perceptions. And by shifting perceptions, you start to shift behavior. And by behavior, I mean, drawing tourism into a country or incentivizing foreign direct investment. And all of these things are part of behavior that's incentivized by an image that was created by someone that left a certain impression or a certain perception in people's minds. And so that was then, I fell in love with public relations and strategic communications that was done that way. And I've been doing that ever since. So yes, there's been, it's been a 22-year career. So, it goes without saying that there's been a lot of different turning points, and I've been pushed in all sorts of directions by myself, but also by people who've mentored me across the world and along the way.
And Mimi, what would you say is driving you today?
I think what's driving me today is to, the desire, the ever-burning desire that I've always had to be able to tell African stories, but also to merge, to be a bridge between, people in America, in Asia, in Europe, and other places who are interested in the potential of our continent and who want to tell their stories in a really authentic way. We always say at Africa Communications Group that we tell stories that are culturally attuned to the environment in which for which they are destined. So, if you're telling a story, or if you're representing a brand or corporate or an organization in Zambia, in the Zambian market, for example, the way that you do that, the way that you understand that market is very different to how you're going to do it in South Africa, to, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, etc. So, I think for me, what's important is to be a bridge between what we have to offer as a continent, which is a huge market, a diverse market, and many resources beyond the natural resources for which we are already known, and the rest of the world. And and my challenge is always, if you want to communicate into Africa, are you doing that in a way that is culturally attuned? Are you doing that in a way that will land with the audiences that you want to communicate to? And so that has always been my challenge, and that will continue to be my challenge. In addition to that, I think it's just growing the next generation of communicators as well, African communicators, and I'd like to see that come true in the next couple of years.
Now, Mimi, talking about leadership, and I know it's a big question, but what does the future of leadership mean to you?
It is a big question, and I've been pondering it since we got connected, because I thought, well, what an interesting time to ask this question. I was just doing an interview the other day where we spoke about, what's going on with the current crisis, for example, and what that means for leadership. And it's very interesting that the eyes of everybody are on our leaders right now. And I'm speaking specifically about our political leaders, but also leaders of enterprises, corporations, etc. And we're almost at a time where we are deciding the sort of leadership that we want to see going forward as a global community. We're sifting the good from the bad, and we're looking at our leaders and saying, oh, that's how it should be done, or that's not how it should be done. And so we're seeking inspirational leadership. And I think for me, that's the future of leadership. And I say that it's an interesting time for you to ask me that question, because that's exactly the question that we're asking ourselves as a global community. What is the future of leadership? What do future leaders look like? How do they act? How do they show up in the world? And I think for me, leaders are people who are, grounded in trust, who can inspire trust in other people. In order to be a great leader, I think trust is key, and how you go about fostering that trust is something that we all need to be concerned with at this time as we deal with the current crisis, but also move on from here.
And Mimi, looking back over your own leadership journey, what have you learned are the qualities, or maybe the most important quality for building future leaders?
I think that for me to be, to build a future leader, I do believe that there's some raw material of leadership that you need to already be working with. Um, I do believe that leaders are made. I also believe that leaders are born. And I think that the ability to be able to see and think beyond self, to have a vision about what the world could look like for the better, what your potential contribution could be, and just to be generally concerned about the state of the world, the state of your community, the state of your family. Beyond yourself is raw material that we look for in every leader, in every sphere, in every sector. And then I think also some vulnerability. I think that leaders are sometimes, come across or are put across by society as being people who shouldn't be vulnerable, who should have it all together. And I think that some of the greatest leaders that I've been able to see and I aim to emulate in my own leadership journey are leaders who have a degree of vulnerability, who are able to say, you know what? I don't know it all. I know this really well, but I don't know it all. And therefore, I'm willing to work in partnership, in collaboration, and really have a multi-stakeholder approach to my leadership. I think that's very, very important. And like I said before, people who inspire trust. I think in my own leadership journey, the other leaders that I've been able to collaborate with and that our collaborations has brought fruit are leaders that have been able to inspire trust, not just in myself, but to those people who looked up to them as leaders.
And maybe when you speak to young upcoming leaders, what is it you tell them about social media? How should they handle and navigate social media to build their own leadership brands?
I think that you need to pick a sweet spot in terms of, there's everybody's talking about thought leadership nowadays. How do I build my thought leadership, etc. I think that, you have to pick. There is so much going on social media. And if you picked a topic, let's say youth, or people who are working with youth or in youth related sectors, there's so much to say about that specific work, just that one topic. And I think that mining your own thought leadership and saying, this is the bigger umbrella of what's going on in terms of conversations globally about this specific topic. How do I add to this conversation? It's almost an academic endeavor. As you know, in academia, you really have to look at a body of work and say, how am I adding to this body of work? What unique contribution can I make to this body of work based on what everybody else has already said? And I think that social media is the same thing. How are you adding value? How are you adding value with your contribution on social media or your thought leadership platform? That's really important. I think the second thing is just being truthful, because as you know, we live in the world of fake news. There's so much going on, there's so much information, and you really don't want to be that person whose content or whose words or stories that are told on social media are not grounded in nothing but the truth. So being truthful is really, really important. So I think those two things, understanding what your specific thought leadership platform is, what you're speaking to, what you can own in terms of positioning and conversation, and then two, really being grounded in facts and the truth, and where you don't know the truth, seeking the truth from experts is really important.
And what is your advice for future leaders in terms of challenges? What are the biggest challenges they should expect to encounter in their career?
Well, I think, in terms of what we've just spoken about, things like social media and exposure of your brand as a leader as well, is there's the challenge of, there's a reputational challenge. There's a constant reputational challenge that you need to be aware of as a leader. And I think you have to decide from the beginning of your journey what you want to be known for, what is going to be your legacy, what is going to be your specific positioning as a leader, and then making sure that you work very hard to live up to the legacy that you've set for yourself. So I think that's the biggest challenge. And then also the speed at which the world is changing. I mean, a couple of months ago, we wouldn't have thought, at least I wouldn't have thought, that the world would have changed so quickly and so dramatically in a few months. And so how do you keep up with that? How do you make sure that you are ready and that you're flexible enough? I think flexibility is one of our biggest challenges as leaders, because some people set their minds on something and the way things should be, and find it very, very difficult to manipulate and move themselves away from that original position that they had in their minds to find a new one that suits the current environment. And so being able to be flexible in your leadership and to adapt to new things is key, but also not just to adapt to new environments, but to change your mind. I think that's one of the biggest things that leaders need to give themselves permission to do, is to be able to change your mind about about the circumstances, your company, the direction in which you're going, etc., and really just be malleable to new ideas and to new findings that are thrown to you both by your environment, but also by other people that you come across with. So those are the three things that I would say are the three biggest challenges I see for future leaders.
Now that brings us to the new skills. Mimi, if you were to design a curriculum for future leaders, what are some of the new skills you would want to factor in?
Well, I think that, this has been the case for a while now, but, there are schools of thought who, that still believe that this might not be as important, but soft skills, communication skills, critical thinking, problem solving, these are skills that we need to be learning, because again, going back to the whole idea of being flexible and malleable as a leader, these are the skills that you need. So, your academic skills and your technical skills may not even be as important as having those soft skills, because no matter what industry you're in or what sector, those are the things that you need to call on, to help you navigate this new world. The second one is digital skills. I mean, we're having this conversation over a computer, and the world has become digitized so quickly. I think we've just leapfrogged a number of years, probably, of digital cognizance and ability over the last couple of months. And so being able to live in that world in a way that is coherent is going to be very important. So definitely digital skills and soft skills are the two sets of skills that I would recommend for future leaders.
And Mimi, as a mentor to future leaders, can you maybe share a success story or two where you mentored an upcoming leader and that person took your advice to heart?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, just recently, actually this week, I had a conversation with a young lady who is going through a career change, and it's been very interesting to watch her rise in her current career and then get to a point where she felt no longer satisfied with what she was doing. She's still very young, still has a really bright future ahead of her. But again, going back to what I was saying earlier, giving yourself permission to change your mind and change your path and to really get in touch with what feels right for you and what feels authentic, and choosing that path, even if it means giving up one that seemed logical to you and to everybody else before. And so, with this young lady, her journey, watching her change her mind and helping her understand. And, going back to what Steve Jobs said, which is, if you look backwards on your journey, the places and the times and the situations where you felt the most happy and the most satisfied, and where you felt for that, even if it's for a split second, you know what, I could really do this even if I wasn't getting paid for it. That's how much I love it. Go back to those times and ask yourself, what was I doing at that point? What made me so happy? And therein lies the clue about what you should be doing going forward. And so this young lady has just, left her path and has now found a job with an international organization, a consultancy firm, that is very much focused on social impact across the world. And so she found her niche, and I'm very happy to have been part of her success story, which continues to evolve. And like I said, she's very young, so I'm looking forward to seeing what she's going to accomplish over the next couple of years. But I'm happy that she's happy.
And Mimi, who are the role models of leadership that you would recommend future leaders should study and maybe learn from?
I think that I would probably say, it depends on what sector, but, Wangari Maathai was, a wonderful, I think, leader in what she did as an activist on the continent. And I spent a lot of time reading about her story, and studying her path, and I draw inspiration from that. I think Steve Jobs was a really great leader, and I look up to him as well. Obviously one of the greatest leaders of all times. I like the journey of Oprah Winfrey. I think that journey of resilience, of stamina, of setting your eyes on a goal and really doing everything in your power to achieve it, is something that's really important. And many, many others. I'm an avid reader, and I love to read autobiographies specifically. So I can think of a number of different, people that, that should be studied and whose journeys are inspiring. But those are the three that come to mind right now.
And Mimi, how best can our listeners connect with you, and where should they follow you?
So our company website is africacommunicationsgroup.com. I'm on Twitter at mkalinda, on LinkedIn as Mimi Kalinda, and on Instagram as well as Mimi Kalinda. And you can also see the work that I do specifically linked to leadership and storytelling at my website, which is mimikalinda.com.
And last but not least, Mimi, is there one piece of advice that you would really like to convey to future leaders that they should implement in their own life?
I think for me, it would be a practical piece of advice. We're speaking now and it's morning in Johannesburg. And just before I got on this call, I was telling myself that I really don't know what I would do if I didn't have a morning routine. It's very interesting. I work with young people all the time, and sometimes I ask them, and I say, what do you do in the morning when you wake up? Do you just kind of like get out of bed and then off you go and start your day? Do you take time to sit down and reflect on what happened yesterday, what's going to happen today, to reconnect with your vision of what you want your path to be? And I think one of the greatest gifts that I give myself on a daily basis is just a bit of time in the morning to connect with myself with, you know, a higher being, whichever one you believe in, but, you know, something higher than yourself, and really to just reflect on where I've been and to think about where I'm going and to connect with that image and that vision before I start my day. And that's been tremendous help. And you know, it might be a small thing, but it's been tremendously helpful to me in my leadership journey. And I just want to pass on that advice.
Well, thank you so much. This is very powerful. And thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom into the future of leadership and being an inspiration to future leaders.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks.